podcast historically, and so last week, I believe somebody on Twitter, I believe her name is Polly, suggested that Ben and I debate on whether it's time to outgrow Chomsky. And so that's where, my position is absolutely, what took you so long? And Ben disagrees.
Excellent. All right. I have you perfectly up there, and then Ben is coming back. Oh, there he is. All right. Oh, wait, but of course Ben would bump the old one out of the way.
The what? Oh, out of the way?
Oh, sorry. If you're not watching the stream right now, I'm basically just adjusting both of you so that it looks like you're on opposite sides, and I've got your names up on the screen and everything. It's a thing. It's nice and fancy, but because Ben logged off for 2 seconds, I have to now readjust it. But just give me 2 seconds, and
got it.
I will be right with you. Perfect. All right. Just let me do one last adjustment.
Can you give me the wait. What's the URL again so I can tell people?
Yeah, no worries. It's twitch.tv/thesurfstv.
Twitch.tv/ found it. But okay. I see now. Okay.
Okay, Ben Burgis versus Esha. And the topic is, should the left abandon Chomsky? All right, we're good to go. Okay,
so outgrow.
Oh, outgrow, sure.
Because abandon is like a totally different phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. I'll just change that at the top.
And then people are going to be like, oh, you can't cancel Chomsky, which is like a total straw man. So I just want to avoid it.
Yeah, no worries. Just give me 1 second. I'm just changing the title. Oh, and Ben, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself before I list the rules and everything?
Sure. My name is Ben Burgis. Wrote a book called Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And more recently was one of 4 authors with Matt McManus, Marian Trejo, Conrad Hamilton, and an introduction by Slavoj Žižek of a book called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. I'm a co-host of the Dead Pundit Society podcast. I do a weekly segment on the Michael Brooks Show called The Debunk. And I am a columnist for Jacobin Magazine, which, according to some people I see on Twitter, means that I work for the CIA, which is kind of cool. I've been watching The Americans lately, so I like the idea of working for an intelligence agency. And I also do a column a couple times a month at Arc Digital Media. And at least for now, I have a job teaching philosophy at Georgia State University Perimeter College, although, of course, with the pandemic and budget cuts and everything, I literally have, since I'm on a year-to-year contract, I literally have no idea what's going on next year. So that's exciting.
And who amongst you is going to be starting? Did you guys determine that already?
We can do it randomly.
We left it open. If you want to do it randomly or you have a preference one way or the other, that's fine with me. It would, if it matters to you, whether you're going first at the beginning or last at the end, then that's fine with me. But it would make sense to me if you went first because you're the one who sort of has a positive case, right? Like, these are the respects in which the left should outgrow Chomsky.
I watched the entire Burgess v. Molyneux debate. It was painful, and I let Molyneux know how bad he was in that debate via Twitter. His witty
so I was just going to quickly do that. 1 sec, sorry, I'm just turning off the alert box. But thank you for the donation. I just don't want to interrupt the debaters when they're in the middle of saying what they're about to say. So everyone, basically how this is going to work is both parties are going to do 5-minute introductions, and then I'm going to basically let you guys go free flow for a little while. I'm going to stay outside of interjecting unless it's just becoming a screaming, yelling head match, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So I don't think I'll need to do anything. So I'll basically just be here to make sure that you stay within the 5 minutes each for your intros. And then afterwards, we'll leave it for some audience questions. And then we can have 5-minute closing statements, if that works.
I thought what we talked about was we were going to do the 5-minute opening statements, 5-minute rebuttals, half an hour of everything else, then the 5-minute closing statements.
Oh, so you'd like everything to be concentrated in like 5-minute rebuttal back and forth?
Well, for an initial round, but then there would be the half an hour free for all,
Okay.
like free flowing exchange / questions from the chat, questions you would throw in, whatever.
Okay, so just to be clear, 5-minute intros each, and then 2 5-minute rebuttals.
No.
Back and forth.
Is that not what you remembered? Sorry, I should say.
We said 1 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay, and then free flow.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, well that makes it easy.
One round of us doing it, so 2 in that sense. But yeah.
All right, sounds great. Okay, well then at this point I will open it up to you, Esha, for your 5-minute introduction.
Okay. Many of you say Chomsky opened your eyes to the distortions of the media and evils of the U.S. empire. Well, I posit that discovering leftism through Chomsky is a privilege. I found leftism as a child in India. I saw a girl who was forced to quit 5th grade because her family was so poor that they could not feed her. At age 12, she claimed she was getting married. Of course, marriage is a euphemism, and we all know what she was forced to do. So it is a privilege to be able to discover the evils of capitalism through reading Chomsky instead of seeing your friends being sold into child prostitution. And if there is one thing capitalism does is give money stolen from other people's labor and redistribute it to the powerful. And there are a lot more privileges of certainty for you. Every time you go to school, you know you're going to come home, and there's a home. In Yemen, Syria, Iraq, people are not so lucky. Sometimes the U.S. might drone your house, or it might be bombed. And turning your whole family into rubble. So there is a difference in experiences for many people, between what they can imagine for themselves and what really happened. And that difference is often seen in Chomsky's works. So Chomsky is one of those armchair critics who sits on comfortably at his tenured professorship at the heart of the imperial core. He's full of critiques of any action taken by the mass. Says, for example, Chomsky says has no proper way to resist and fight against forces of capitalism or imperialism that he monotonously bores you guys with. So, for example, there was in 1967, Chomsky said that people should dodge their draft as a form of resistance. He got a letter from this guy named William X, who said if people were to just dodge their draft, they're just volunteering for prison at that point, and they're not helpful to anyone. What we need is real sabotage activities. Chomsky kind of mumbled that it was counterproductive, and he didn't actually know why, but that's basically what happened. He says that in Palestine, he says the BDS movement is a victory for Israeli propaganda, as if Israeli propaganda doesn't already claim victories on everything. So there is no proper way for the powerless to seize power that won't elicit Chomsky's scorn. Any successful revolution is either not real socialism or authoritarianism. I wish this were a parody, but in his book, he describes in his book on anarchy, 3 different successful spontaneous revolution projects. Do you want me to tell you what it is? Italy in 1919, Spain in 1936, and I kid you not, Germany in 1919. What do these 3 projects have in common? Well, to me, if real socialism means losing to Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, I want no part of it. And right now, I know I'm going to make you jump, but Chomsky has typical liberal tendencies. Liberals are idealists. An idealist has a definition of socialism in his head which is divorced from all context. Every time they encounter a real-world example, they compare it with the ideal in their head, only to arrive at the predictable judgment that it is not real socialism and the revolution has been hijacked and destroyed. For Marxists, we understand that society has always been a giant class war, and we use the practice of historical materialism. Marxists look at all ideas through historical context and judging each action by their effects on the class struggle. They investigate a group of exploited people and how they asserted their interests and how they won ground in the eternal power struggle. They identify who in society have opposed them and observe the methods the opposition uses.
30 seconds.
Okay, so Chomsky, on the other hand, completely rejects it. He is what we call an idealist. So he has, let's use the idea of democracy. Most ideologists have a set of rights given to them by their, it's a set of rights, and basically they have imbibed the definition of bourgeoisie democracy and human rights without even living it. I mean, without even realizing it. For example, Chomsky once said that the United States is unprecedented, is the freest country in the world, and I don't think there's freedom of speech.
That's time, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll continue later.
All right, Ben, 5-minute opening to you.
Sure. So I think that in an effort to make this opening statement and save response for the response, I'll start out talking about why Chomsky is important, why I think he's a necessary starting point for the left, and what I think about the suggestion that we should outgrow him, or what that would necessarily mean. So I was looking again at a book that I read many years ago by the great Pakistani-born leftist Tariq Ali, called Bush in Babylon, the Recolonization of Iraq, where he has this nice line about Chomsky where he says, what his detractors in the US media do not realize is the main reason for Chomsky's enormous popularity and prestige in Asia and Latin America. Lots of non-privileged people are big fans of his, is not that he offers strategic or tactical advice, which he does not, but that he speaks a truth that is uncomfortable to those in power. In the world of today, that is a rarity. And of course, Ali is praising Chomsky there, but I do want to ground this by talking about one respect in which there might be some overlap between Esha and me, which is that first, obviously, I don't think, and I don't think Chomsky would think, that anybody should be above criticism, certainly. And I think there are some limitations to Chomsky's project. In other words, there are both some takes of his that I disagree with, but more importantly, I think that there are respects in which what he does, while important, isn't the only important thing that needs to be done. So, for example, a friend, the historian Daniel Bessner, talks about how Chomsky's generation of leftists came up in a situation in which the left, at least in countries like the United States, was completely powerless. So grappling with certain kinds of questions about how to change that isn't part of his project. And of course, that is something we need to fill in. But I think Chomsky represents a absolutely necessary starting point for the left. And I think that what I'm hearing that's framed as a suggestion that we outgrow him in many ways strikes me as a suggestion that actually we regress from that important starting point. So, what's important about that starting point? Well, I would point, for example, to an article I'd strongly recommend by Nathan Robinson called "Lessons from Chomsky," in which some of the things that he talks about, I'll just pick one for the sake of time, that Chomsky is very good at, is rejecting simple binary distinctions. So by that, I mean that Chomsky is ruthlessly honest about the nuances of the world that we live in and the situation that the left faces, but he does this honesty without sacrificing moral clarity. So he doesn't lie about or buy into simplistic and just implausible apologia for countries that happen to be in the U.S. crosshairs, but he has the moral clarity to realize that our overwhelming emphasis needs to be on talking about the crimes committed by our own government, both because the U.S. government happens to be the most important criminal entity in the world, and it's doing the most damage, but also because even if it was only doing 1% of the damage, that's the 1% that from that position that Esha was talking about in the heart of the beast, we're in the most position to do something about it. No, I'm at about 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Yes, thank you. But in any case, I think also his position, which I know is not Esha's main objection, but often comes up about the tactical dilemma that's presented by voting, also is founded on that important recognition of complexity, and that losing that complexity isn't outgrowing Chomsky, it's regressing from that necessary starting point.
Okay, back to you for the rebuttal.
Sometimes, okay, so the first thing that Ben said is that Chomsky, I guess Chomsky, okay, so let's go back to what Chomsky does not do. He actually rejects the idea of dialectical materialism. So he has an ideal in his head. So, for example, and often he accepts bourgeoisie ideas of human rights. So in order to avoid falling into this trap, let's remember that democracy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's an idea that exists in the minds of people living under historical circumstances. So we always need to ask democracy for whom and what kind of democracy. So he often says the U.S. is a democracy, but a failed democracy or something like that. But what he doesn't do is finally parse into details. For example, what is a worker democracy? It's whenever a worker democracy is when the will of the people can never overrule capital. In America, for example, a few years ago, there were many cities that banned fracking. And so what happened was that capital came in with ALEC and basically went to the state legislators and said, hey, cities, you can't ban fracking because you just don't have the right to ban fracking. And then so there, the capital actually overruled the will of the people. So to call America a democracy is is a bit overstating it. It is a bourgeoisie democracy, but not a dictatorship of the proletariat. So Chomsky does is that he often abstracts the idea of class away from his analysis. So liberals also do this, and that's why they get this thing called the Horseshoe Theory, where they're just like, liberating Auschwitz is just as morally wrong as creating Auschwitz, which we know is false. So, for example, Chomsky repeats the old cliche about the people's stick. But the people will feel no better if the stick which they are beaten is labeled the people's stick. Except he fails to analyze that who is holding the people's stick. If the people are holding the stick, we're going to beat up corporations like Amazon and Ford and defense contractors and imperialists and landlords. But if it's the corporations that are holding the stick, they're going to beat up people to make them work harder. So instead of that, it shows you that his analysis often just misses the basic point because he actually outright rejects materialism. He says it's some sort of gibberish. So what happens is that he often may have a detailed critique, but often it's not relevant, or it's just sometimes it's not relevant. So let's take the First Amendment example. He says America is the freest country, has a lot of free speech. But if we look at the history of the First Amendment, let's look at the case Brandenburg v. Ohio, a 1969 case where the court struck down an Ohio statute where KKK members were arrested for incendiary speech. So many during that time, including Chomsky, claimed that it was a positive step forward because it led to a reversal of prior decisions against communists. Guess what? After Brandenburg, we have Dennis v. U.S., and they upheld the CP-USA Smith Decision Act, which allows the U.S. to kind of bar and purge communists. So in other words, the Supreme Court actually gave the Klan a pass that it had withheld from the communists for years, and then it reversed this decision just for the Klan member, and then reversed it back for the communists. So then you have to look at the thousands of examples of how free speech has been used in the U.S. For example, in the Supreme Court in Public Citizen v. Virginia Pharmacy, they invoked the First Amendment to allow deceptive advertising to pharmacies. We know Citizens United. And so...
30-second wording.
Okay, when you look at Chomsky's analysis, it might look like it's deep, but he misses this class component that I just explained of the way the First Amendment is deregulatory when he talks about free speech. And it is very important for people to understand the class component of every issue, because otherwise you cannot even figure out how to get power and even who opposes you as a basic step.
Okay, that's time. 5-minute rebuttal to you, Ben.
So I want to start out with just a quick factual correction. Esha just said that in Brandenburg versus Ohio, which, well, talk more about the details of that for a second, but that in that case, the Supreme Court was reversing this anti-free speech precedent for the sake of the Klan. But then,
no, I did not say for the sake of the Klan. I said, I'm sorry. I said the Supreme Court, when it was the Klan, it reversed it. That's different. I didn't say it happened because, but I said the Supreme Court
for the Klan. But I'm happy to use whatever wording you want. Lance, we started.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Start over the clock now. Okay. I mean, I got like 3 words out, but okay, that's fine. All right. So, in any case, that the presentation that I heard was that in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court, when the Klan's free speech rights were at stake, they made a very pro free speech decision, and that this decision was essentially reversed in Dennis versus United States, which had to do with the Communist Party. And I think actually not only is this wrong, but it's really interesting to look at why that's wrong and to relate that to Chomsky's views about free speech, and then get into some of these larger issues like what he means when he talks about materialism and whether there's something important about dialectical materialism that he's missing. So, as a matter of fact, it's the part that's correct was that Dennis versus United States was about the Communist Party, and Brandenburg versus Ohio was about the Klan. That's true. But actually, the Dennis versus the United States was decided in 1951, and Brandenburg versus Ohio was decided in 1969. So so the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision is the one that's up and running and relevant right now. It's not that they first made the anti-free speech decision or the pro-free speech decision and then reversed it. Right, first they made a more restrictive decision about free speech, and then they reversed it with the less restrictive one. And it's important to note that the reason that somebody like Chomsky, while obviously not liking the Klan, would be in favor of the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision actually gets back to something Esha said in her first statement. that she was faulting Chomsky for not supporting more militant tactics in the anti-war movement. I would argue that actually mass draft resistance was fairly effective, as were all kinds of other things the anti-war movement was also doing that Chomsky was supporting, like GI coffee houses, which led to resistance among GIs directly in Vietnam. But the effect of this, right? What was at stake in the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision, which of course didn't just apply to the Klan, right? Supreme Court decisions don't just apply to the petitioner; they then apply to everybody. Was whether or not you can advocate things like sabotage without getting arrested for the mere advocacy. So I think if you're going to fault Chomsky for not supporting a riskier or more, in his view, tactically dubious set of tactics, I think it's also important to realize that it's wise to at least support setting the precedent that creates room for that. Now, Chomsky doesn't support anything like what sometimes strawman does, a magic paper approach to the Constitution. I think that's as overwhelmingly clear. For the sake of timing, we can get into that in the back and forth. But I think he does understand that the need for the state to reproduce hegemony by using these legitimizing institutions does often lead to legal institutions like the Supreme Court recognizing rights that do actually create room for groups like, in fact, the Communist Party. So
30 seconds.
All right. What does Chomsky mean when he says that in certain respects the United States is the freest country in the world? He's talking about certain kinds of free speech rights. He also talks about how the corporations in which most Americans work are totalitarian institutions. I think if you look at the respects in which he thinks it's free and the respects in which it's unfree, I think it's actually a much better analysis than it might sound. And it's one that actually, even though he comes from a different tradition and doesn't use this terminology, does have a lot of dialectical nuance to it.
Okay, so why don't we do it this way? Do you want to do 15 minutes of back and forth and then 15 minutes of audience Q&A with the last half hour?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. All right, so why don't we start with you, Esha?
Okay, so basically, repeat. I'm sorry I got the dates wrong with the Dennis v. U.S. versus Brandenburg. But what the Supreme Court has repeatedly done, this is since 1970s, of course, is that it has used the First Amendment for deregulation. For example, in Public Citizen v. Virginia Pharmacy, it invoked the First Amendment to allow advertisement by pharmaceuticals. But we do not see the same kind of way the First Amendment has been invoked to protect citizens. For example, Ramsey Orta, the man who took the video, he's still in prison, maybe not for the for whatever reason. And then there's, of course, the Citizens United, which, and there's another, I can't remember this exact decision, but there was a decision where the Supreme Court said it was okay. They said it was okay to use the Boy Scouts for, Boy Scouts could ban gay people because of freedom of assembly. So the point is, none of these rights exist in abstract. They're always wielded against a class of people by a class of people. And so Chomsky never acknowledges that. Oh, maybe he does mildly, but he still falls into the liberal trap of not getting context, not understanding who's in power. And I know he wrote a book called Understanding Power, but often it kind of doesn't actually understand power. So, for example, he says that he idealizes spontaneous movements, but the problem is that we have the FBI, the CIA, and the U.S. military to actually fight against spontaneous revolutionary movements. So what chance does the powerless have when you have the FBI, CIA, whatever, to constantly undermine spontaneous revolutionary movements? But for him, he's never thought about that. And nuance. He often, for example, he thinks like he's just often been wrong. For example, he said that.
So I wonder if maybe before we get into those other responses, if it would be good to talk a little bit more about the free speech issue, because I think one thing that is important to recognize why Chomsky, who by the way I think has a very good understanding of the operations of power and the way, for example, in which the U.S. media, one of the subjects he's written most about, operates to freeze out points of view that contradict dominant narratives. But I think that, like, for example, you can recognize that it's true that in a broad brush sense, one class is exercising power over another class. Of course, that's true. And of course, Chomsky would agree that that's true. But also that the institutional means by which they do so and the strategies they use to legitimize that rule do make a real difference for people resisting them. And the Brandenburg case is actually a great example of that. Because it's not just a matter of sort of ad hoc, okay, they'll pretend that we have these free speech rules, when there's a group that serves the interests of capital, they won't otherwise. I think if that decision hadn't gone that way, not, of course, there wasn't plenty of repression of the New Left, but there was a lot of new left and anti-war activity post 1969 that couldn't have happened without much faster and much more efficient repression without those standards. Now, I wish that line about the people's stick was a cliche. Unfortunately, I think that most people, including most people on the left, have never heard it. But I think it's important to recognize, you talked about who's holding the stick. And well, if we hold the stick, then, we're going to beat up Amazon and all these companies. And I think that the point that Chomsky would rightly call attention to is who's we, right? Does we mean some sort of democratic institution representing working people, which of course is only actually possible if you have free exchange of views among the workers, so people could participate and decide and collectively make up their minds within that? Or does we mean some party state bureaucracy claiming to act on behalf of the people, which is where I think that people's stick line is much more appropriate. And I would just wrap up the point by calling attention to one particularly telling example, which is if you're going to talk about the relationship between the people's stick and corporations, well, look at one of the largest sticks in the world today that was built up calling itself the People's Stick, the one in the People's Republic of China, which not only does not exercise today that stick against corporations, but once the stick was built up and once it got to be so big that it was impossible to do things like organize a real independent trade union, then what often happens, which is that the operators of that stick decided that they would be better off going from exercising their privileges in this indirect way through this party state bureaucracy to exercise them in a more direct way by making a transition to capitalism while keeping the people's stick. And today, the people's stick is the enforcer of the corporate power of companies like Foxconn that exploit working people with the kind of efficient brutality, in squeezing out every drop of profit possible, with the people's stick always lurking in the background, that they literally have to build suicides to stop workers from killing it and decided to kill themselves in the middle of the shift. And I'd say, looking at that progression over time, Chomsky is somebody who, again, he's very nuanced about this. He's all about recognizing the real accomplishments and virtues, for example, of the Cuban Revolution. He's gone on and on about that. But I think in recognizing the danger of building up that kind of people stick, unrestricted by democratic checks and a right to disagree, I think that he's shown himself to be far more perceptive, far more insightful.
Ben, I think we should pass it off just a little bit. You've had a long time to speak.
Okay.
Well, I'm looking at Chinese, China actually cracked down on Foxconn. They said that Foxconn and Apple were violating Chinese labor laws, and basically they had monitors there to basically change it. And so the corporation they also lost about 30 to 15%. So yeah, China. It's easy to make a straw man about China, but I know they did.
Plenty of cases of the U.S. cracking down on labor law violators, and labor laws.
Like when did the U.S. do it?
When has the U.S. enforced labor law? Like ever? Okay, all right. I think that you're not going to have any trouble. Go on Google, find.
No, you find an example.
No, I'm sorry, but if you're going to make an incredible claim, an obviously false and absurd claim, like the United States, the United States has never enforced labor law. Of course they have. Now, in fact, if you compare labor law in the United States, or even a United States client with a history of being horribly repressive, like Taiwan, to China. Like Taiwan, where Foxconn is actually from, in many ways the labor laws are better than China. Minimum wage is higher.
No, actually, but the cost of living is different, and that's just really okay. So let me.
Do you think adjusted for cost of living, the minimum wage is higher in China?
I don't know. But what I do know is that yesterday, for example, the state of Ohio had a hotline for reporting employers to report their employees if they were to go off if they ask for having coronavirus. You can actually come up with the time when the U.S. has actually so I don't know why you can't come up with an easy example of when the U.S. has cracked down on labor law violations.
Oh, for God's sake, that's such a cheap and dishonest response to something obvious, clearly the procedure for doing this is spending 15 minutes. Okay. So to be clear, is your contention that there has never been a case where the United States has enforced?
My contention is that you can't find an example right now because you're not really. My contention is you just can't seem to find an example to prove your argument.
Yeah, is that the fact that I don't have labor law cases off of the top of my head.
Google exists.
Something about I'm actually listening to what you're saying and not stopping and doing 5 minutes of research in the middle of a debate. If you're going to pretend like that establishes anything about anything, that's unbelievably bad faith.
No, it's not. You seem to want to bad faith.
All right, can we ground this back to the topic at hand, maybe? Because I think we're going way off. We're veering far away from it.
Well, no, because bad faith, he often uses it as a tactic, which means basically not.
Of what else I've used as a tactic. If I often use it, do what you asked me to. Tell me when else I've used it.
You've used it for just about like in this whole Twitter exchange where you claim
Okay, both everyone, everybody.
Operator.
Okay. Again, we're veering into the personal. We're going way off the topic. We should be concentrating on should the left outgrow Chomsky, right? That's the topic that you both agreed that you're going to talk about.
Let's ask Ben so let me ask Ben a question. Okay, so you said that workers need free speech in order to have a democracy. So what effect does this little work if the worker uses their free speech to say Heil Hitler? Does it enhance, how does a worker having the right to say Heil Hitler enhance democracy?
If you want to look at the relationship between cracking down on people saying Heil Hitler and cracking down on the kind of exchange of views that actually do matter for the sake of a functional democracy, then I think one really relevant real-world case to look at is the attempts in Lance's home country, Canada, to use the hate speech laws to crack down against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement about Palestine. The point is, as with the people's stick, when you build up,
Canada does not have the people's stick because it's a bourgeoisie democracy.
Yes, I'm not claiming that Canada has the people's stick. I'm claiming that the point about the people's stick also applies in this case, which is that when you empower people to decide which views can be expressed and which can't be expressed without crackdown, simply hoping that it's only going to be used in the case that it should be used without any sort of institutional safeguards against that is hopelessly naive.
So you still did not answer the question. How do the workers benefit?
I'm pretty sure I did.
Like, let's say that I'm in a group with workers and one person keeps saying Heil Hitler. Like, how is that, how are the people's will being advanced? Because that is what democracy is. Like, how is the collective will of the people there being advanced by that one worker saying Heil Hitler?
By him saying it? Not at all. But of course, that's a straight drawdown of what it said. The actual question is... No, it's not. That's the obvious distortion of what I said. The actual question on the...
All right, when both of you talk over each other, no one can hear either of you. So it all just kind of becomes white noise, all right?
So I actually just used the word Heil Hitler. I did not say anything else about it. My exact thing was, so you agreed that there may be times when free speech does not always advance democracy, is what I was trying to say. Because you agree that... Okay, so you think it's okay.
If you're interested in what I said, I can say it, but you seem to be more interested in finding ways to caricature it. What I said was that that I think institutional safeguards of free speech are crucial to the meaningful possibility of democratic deliberation and decision making by a group of workers. That's a very different thing from saying that any particular use of that free speech advances that. Obviously, lots of uses of free speech aren't going to advance that. The question about whether free speech is necessary for democracy isn't about whether any given use of free speech is good for democracy.
Okay.
It's about whether democracy is better safeguarded by having those institutional protections or not. That's the serious question.
So what I'm going to do for the last 15 minutes is...
Wait, 1 second. Let me answer this. The problem is that you do not have a values neutral approach, as in the same like democracy quote free speech. Like Citizens United, what they use free speech as an excuse for Citizens United. How exactly does that advance democracy? So I'm saying in order to properly analyze free speech itself, you need to figure out against who, like you need to have a class analysis on how the different classes can use free speech to advance democracy or not. Like, for example, Citizens United, is that, do you think money is speech? Clearly not. But so what I'm saying is that you can't just have an abstract free speech box, but you have to investigate it more deeply to figure out how is this alleged democracy using free speech? And who is getting the free speech rights? And is it evenly distributed? And that kind of analysis is what Chomsky keeps on missing.
Okay, can we move on to the
distinct one-sentence response? You can think that the interests of the working class are best advanced by a broad, value-neutral interpretation of free speech without thinking Citizens United was correctly decided. There's no contradiction there.
Okay, we're going to move on to the audience Q&A. If both of you keep talking over each other, I'm going to have to mute you until we can sort this out. So let's just try and stick to what we agreed upon from the start. We're going to do 50 minutes, and I'm going to get audience questions that are just directed at one of you, so that it doesn't have to be a rebuttal back and forth. So you can answer that person's question, try to keep it within like a 3-minute time range, and then from that we can move back and forth, okay? So the first one is for Ben. What does he think about Chomsky's genocide denial and protecting genocide denial as free speech? In Ben's eyes, that genocide denial is something we should overlook, or should we actually help spread the fact that Chomsky denies genocide since so many Western leftists gloss over that?
Well, I reject the premise of the question that he does deny genocides, the germ of truth, and this is actually interesting. I think that a fair critique of Chomsky is that sometimes in some situations his instincts were actually a little bit too tanky. So after years of ardent involvement and getting arrested a bunch of times in the anti-war movement, and really being a very loud voice against the atrocities and semi-genocidal policy of the United States in Vietnam, when the first reports started to trickle in about the Khmer Rouge killing fields, his first instinct was to think, okay, this sounds like just more imperialist propaganda about this. And so he was initially somewhat skeptical, but this was for a very short period of time. For decades since then, he hasn't been a genocide denier about the Khmer Rouge. He talks about it all the time. There are no other instances of him engaging in anything that could be called genocide denial. And in fact, the only real example of a full-scale intervention, full-scale invasion of a country that I know of that Chomsky has supported was the intervention by communist Vietnam to invade China to stop that genocide.
Okay, first of all, Zero Tankies actually supported Pol Pot because, so that's like a misuse of the term. So this is what Chomsky said in 1989. The one in Timor we called a Benin bloodbath. The United States didn't care much one way or the other. So hundreds of thousands of Timorese get killed. It's not very interesting. The case in Cambodia was, of course, a nefarious bloodbath, and the bad guys were doing it. And he also later says Cambodia, it was carried out by the enemy Pol Pot. Except for the fact that Pol Pot was not an enemy of the U.S. In fact, Kissinger said, you should tell them we bear no hostility towards them. We would like them to be an independent counterweight to North Vietnam. Ronald Reagan actually supported Pol Pot 3 times in allowing them to be part of the UN. And this is the statement that many human rights activists said, including Jane Fonda. We are profoundly disturbed that for the third year, the United States voted to keep Pol Pot's Democratic Kampuchea in the UN. So if Chomsky, so this happened in the 1980s, why did Chomsky say that Pol Pot was an official enemy in 1989? So, that's all I had to
respond to that.
Yeah, I'll give you a minute. But again, can we stick to the questions because they're person independent? So let's go down that road.
Yeah.
But yeah.
When Chomsky says bad guy there, he's obviously doing what he very commonly does. If you know Chomsky's style at all, this is a frequent rhetorical device, dripping with irony. He's using
He called it the
Excuse me, Esha. This is my turn. You can talk later. He's dripping with irony, talking about the language that would be used by right-wing Cold Warriors at the time. Chomsky has everything you said about U.S. support for Pol Pot after that Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia that Chomsky supported is true, of course, but Chomsky has also talked about everything you just said on numerous occasions. The US started supporting Pol Pot after Vietnam invaded, but at the time, it was something that the United States was not yet supported, and in fact, was using the killing fields as propaganda to retroactively justify the war, which is what he's correctly calling attention to. There's no contradiction between those.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to a question for Esha. Okay,
hold on. That's factually just wrong. I suggest that everyone go into literally, like I have it on Twitter. Basically, there's a speech. So 1975 was when Henry Kissinger said he supported the Democratic Kampuchea, which is like what Pol Pot came. So I don't understand like where you're getting the whole that the first calls of genocide came from 1977. So I just don't understand where you're getting this from.
Okay.
So
we can't keep doing this.
Chomsky has never said the United States was opposed to Pol Pot in 1975.
Let's just stick to the format, all right? We have 10 minutes left. We get through this 10 minutes. You both get closing arguments, and you don't have to yell at each other anymore. So.
Oh no, we're not yelling. We're just discussing.
Okay, so Esha, what does free speech have to do with canceling Chomsky?
Free speech itself is an example. I'm just saying that I'm not canceling Chomsky, but I'm saying that Chomsky kind of makes you infantile, where you can't tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys. For example, with Pol Pot versus, because he has no class analysis. I mean, there's a quote where Chomsky compares Lenin to Robert McNamara. Is power to the Soviets the same thing as kill everything that moves? Obviously not. So it's a lot of aesthetics. Let's see. There's he also gets into the bumbling empire theory, where he says America often makes mistakes. These are not mistakes. These are basically the U.S. empire protecting the upper class, the bourgeoisie, in exchange for the proletariat. None of this is a mistake. It's all done in order. And then he kind of so that the way he has a values neutral mindset in free speech, where he kind of once it was hilarious. He was like, well, in America, sometimes you get these tenured professors who write books on Holocaust denial. And the first thing that came into my mind is, why the bleep do we have Holocaust deniers who are tenured professors? And so it's a values neutral way that is a bourgeoisie way of looking at human rights that basically idealizes a majority of the revolutions that lose and demonizes all the revolutions that win. And on top of it, the fact that Chomsky fans who read Manufacturing Consent can't actually understand that the U.S. will try to manufacture consent against a socialist revolution is pretty telling.
Okay, for Ben, there are objections to Chomsky's stance free speech with regards to the sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, the Forizon affair or the Forizon affair, maybe? I don't know if it's French. Could you address it, please?
I think that that just goes back to the exact question that Esha was raising earlier about the worker who says Heil Hitler. So Chomsky has certainly condemned Holocaust denial in no uncertain terms. He said we shouldn't even debate it, because when we treat that as being up for debate, then we are we're losing some of our humanity. That should just be exiled to the margins. So he actually supports and basically what he describes the manufacturing consent model being used against Holocaust denial, but he thinks that letting the state, any state, a capitalist state or or a self-described, often not actually people state, decide which views you can express and which you shouldn't express is short-sighted and ultimately self-defeating to the project of building socialism.
Okay, for Esha, and if you don't know what this reference is, then my apologies. The question is, what is the Chomsky project, and can you explain it?
For me?
Yeah.
I don't I never said anything about Chomsky's project. I always maintain that he has no project.
Okay, understandable.
Ben is the one who called Chomsky's project.
I did.
Yeah, weird. It was directed at you. All right, let me scroll down to the next question. In your opinion, what exactly is the biggest shortcoming of Chomsky in the modern era? Can we not just use his old teachings and old books and literature as a stepping stone?
Okay, basically he's not adaptable to the situation. He does not look at each individual situation and look at the historical context, look at the material context, and then make a decision on that or a recommendation. So I would like to compare Michael Parenti with Noam Chomsky or Lasordo. For example, so in 2011, when Libya was being invaded, Chomsky made some kind of mild statement that kind of went both ways. And it kind of said there were times when NATO intervention was justified. On the other hand, actually put up this list on Facebook about the 12 things in Libya will never now have now that NATO went in. So just things like that. He does not. So he rejects the idea of dialectic materialism. So he doesn't get these little things. And those little things that he doesn't understand always add up to be in the service of the empire. So what I would recommend is check out Inventing Reality by Michael and compare that with Manufacturing Consent, and you get to make your own decision.
Ask Ben Burgis why it was right for Chomsky to defend the U.S. imperialism in Syria last year.
I don't think he did. I think that as with Libya, actually, I think these are both really good cases for evaluating Chomsky's views. What he's done is, as part of a strategy of unmasking the motives of the intervention, which he said lots of times. He thinks that the intervention in Libya was illegal, was incredibly dangerous, etc. He said so at every stage. But the point he made is, look, if the point really was, as people like Samantha Powers and Hillary Clinton often said at the time, if the point was to just try to stop these immediate massacres that the extreme right-wing dictator of Libya was about to carry out, then they could have done that with just some no-fly zones. And the point of bringing that up is precisely in order to unmask that the intervention that happened was not a genuinely humanitarian one. Similarly, in Syria, in fact, this is hilarious because oftentimes a certain kind of I think extremely simplistic and undialectical critic of imperialism will the same way they accuse Chomsky of de facto supporting imperialism by telling the truth about Assad, or by saying that the way that the United States sort of went a few hundred yards in the other direction in order to let their imperial ally massacre the Kurds was bad, right, or somehow undermines his anti-imperialism. That same way, lots of leftists who have the equally unnuanced and undialectical take that that because Assad was so bad, you should support U.S. imperialism there, will accuse Chomsky of being an Assadist. He's neither one. He has a refreshing and important recognition of the complexity of the situation.
Aisha,
hold on.
Oh, sorry, yeah,
one comment. It's okay. This Ben actually made a perfect illustration of what I was saying. You kind of don't take class into account. He called Gaddafi an extreme right winger.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Actually, so that's why you have to look at the economic system of Libya under Gaddafi. And so the 16 things that Libya will never see again by Michael Parenti, for example, is that there was no electricity bill in Libya, and electricity was free for all its citizens. There was no interest on loans. Banks in Libya were state-owned, and loans were given to all citizens at 0% interest by law. In Libya was considered a human right. All newlyweds in Libya used to receive 60,000 dinars by the government to set up their first and medical treatments were free in Libya. Before Gaddafi, only 25% of Libyans were literate, and now, well, at least in 2011, 83% are literate. If Libyans wanted to take up a farming career, they would have received farming land, a farming house, equipment, seeds, livestock to kickstart their farm, all for free. If Libyans could not find the education or medical facilities they needed, the government funded them to go abroad to do it. If Libyans brought a car, 50% of them, they would subsidize, the government subsidized 50% of this price. And so every time a mother gave birth to a child, a Libyan received 5,000 US dollars. So just the fact that Ben couldn't tell the difference between who's left wing and right wing shows you that the importance of why we need a dialect.
Yeah, I think that the communists massacred in Libya would disagree with that assessment. The people brought for extraordinary rendition as part of the war on terror to Libya during the years of alliance with the United States would reject that. And if you actually look at the history of neoliberal economic reforms in Libya in the final years of Gaddafi and the way that the IMF praised him for that, that really undermines a lot of what we just heard.
Actually, no, because this actually is another one.
Okay, but we're gonna have to be quick on this just because we only have the rebuttals now. Okay,
that's not how the IMF is not. That's just not how the IMF works. You do not have a choice with the IMF because often they do what you call disaster capitalism. I have an entire episode about how the countries lose monetary sovereignty with the IMF, and often it's kind of done with the barrel of the gun. So I'll put a link to it on my Twitter. So literally this shows the IMF. I have another episode on the history of the IMF. So the IMF is a tool of imperialism. And so again, Chomsky thinking. And also Gaddafi armed revolutionaries against the Western Empire, and there's a lot of wonderful things that Libya won't have. They're literally trading slaves right now. And so, see, this is what happens when you don't have dialectic material, is that you turn into a tweet where you say, there is absolutely no difference between bad, and I don't want you guys to turn into a drill tweet.
Well, that's obviously a ridiculous straw man, but it's true that there are still slave markets in Libya, which is why Chomsky was right to oppose that intervention. And it's also true that the IMF is a tool of imperialism. But I think that if you can't tell the difference between collaborators with a tool to imperialism and resistors to that tool, you've lost the plot.
Okay, we're going to do the 5-minute closing statements. So I'm going to start with 5 minutes on the clock for you, Ben.
No,
sorry, you said the other way around. Sorry. Okay, 5 minutes on the clock for you, Esha.
I think I said this, but so yeah, exactly. And that's why in order to be able to tell collaborators versus resistors, you really need to look at the finer details, and you need dialectic materialism is what I would say. So we kind of agree on 90% of it, but I think that the only way you can actually do that is through dialectic materialism is what I have to add. Oh, no, I'm done.
Sure. So I think that I started out by quoting Tariq Ali talking about the reason for Chomsky's tremendous popularity in the Third World, in Latin America, and Asia, because of the work that he's done methodically, analytically, opposing the crimes of the empire. And I think that it's important to recognize the reasons why he's been so effective in doing that, as well as what I would regard as the genuine limitations of his project, right? So what he's done, he could be doing anything with his life. He could just rest on his laurels of being the world's greatest linguist and inventing cognitive science in its modern form. But instead, he's used his position to do this relentless work as an anti-imperialist. And the reason that he's been so effective in that is because of the things that Nathan Robinson talks about in the article that I recommended earlier, Lessons from Chomsky. So one of those is just the fact that he's this very clear and accessible writer. But another of those is that rejects simple binary distinctions. And this is profoundly important because, if Chomsky were doing apologetics, if any time a stick looked at the people's stick, if you looked at certain aspects of a country or a situation and blinded yourself to inconvenient ones, then you just celebrated it, you identified it with the people, you denied its crimes, then you wouldn't have this kind of credibility when you do what Chomsky spends 99% of his time on, which is exposing the crimes of the empire. Because if you just seem like a hack apologist, you're just not going to be effective in that. When he talks, as he often does, about the Washington consensus between Republicans and Democrats and why it's incredibly dangerous, how it needs to be fought against, how consent is manufactured for that. And by the way, recognizing how manufacturing consent works doesn't mean just blindly and undialectically assuming that the opposite of whatever the empire happens to say about any subject is true. That's not good analysis. But if he's going to do all that, I think it's important that he's also honest about the tactical questions that arise in elections. So I'll give up any time I have after this because Esha's statement was so short. I know mine has already been much longer, but I'll just say this as a final point, that it's important to also do the things that Ali recognized in that first statement, as Daniel Bessner often talks about Chomsky in his generation of leftists often aren't doing, which is thinking about strategy for power in countries like the United States so we can take down the empire for the inside. That has historically been Chomsky's role. But the kind of analytic rigor and brutal honesty that Chomsky brings to the table is an absolutely necessary starting point. And whether we're talking about swing state tactical voting or whether we're talking about the question of frankly recognizing that the working class was not wielding power in the countries that claim to be beating people with the people's stick, Chomsky represents an absolutely necessary starting point. And even if it's done in the name of outgrowing him, it would be a huge mistake to regress away from that starting point.
Okay, all right, thank you. Do you both want to give some quick, plugs to yourselves and your work and what do you do?
Yeah, please check out my podcast at historically.substack.com. And if Andre is in the audience, he can tweet out the link he can send the link and also the Twitter URL. I do a lot of detailed research and a lot of history, and you'll be surprised by how much we forget. We actually forget a lot, and we also misremember a lot. And it's really important, I think, just for everyone to kind of just look through the history and see what we've forgotten and what we've missed and what we got wrong the last time.
Ben? Yeah, I think that's very important. So yeah, you can check me out on the Michael Brooks Show and the Dead Pundit Society every week. The David Feldman Show most weeks, and I have, if you like what I do and you think it's important and you want to support it, I have a Patreon's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, and I recently promised that if it got over a certain threshold of people supporting me there, I would do the literary equivalent of eating a bowl of spiders and read Glenn Beck's book about socialism. So my bowl of spiders has arrived, and I've started doing that. And I don't know, just thank you again. I know that it hasn't necessarily been easy to wrangle us, but I think it was an interesting discussion.
Question: whose debate did you enjoy? Me or when Justice Lee Peterson kept on yelling "beta, beta"? At you?
I'll tell you what. The The one with Jesse Lee Peterson probably gave more people more joy. I know friends who will say that they'll like get drunk and watch that, or they'll make everybody else they know watch that because they think it's hilarious, right? But I think that this one was probably a lot more intellectually interesting. Jesse Lee Peterson.
We should do this again sometime, but that was really bizarre. I admire you for Jesse Lee. Sorry, that was the bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably until I die, every once in a while, people are gonna like see me in an event and yell out "Beta," because as frustrated as frustrated it was at the time, and I think you could see me get frustrated in that debate. I will also admit that it was hilarious.
Okay. Well, have a great day, everyone.
All right, thank you very much. Bye, guys. And everybody, I have been streaming for 6 hours, so I'm going to send y'all to DJ Indian. Please be nice to 1/3 of A Tribe Called Red. We'll do a deep dive and analysis of this debate and the stuff and all the things. You know the thing. Yeah, then thanks for stopping by, everybody. I am going to